So first of all, thanks to Professor Hannah Knox for being with us today to share her ideas and present her book. Hannah Knox is a professor of anthropology at the University College London, UCL, where she lectures on digital anthropology and material culture. This is also her specific entry into the topic of today somehow, as she's concerned with understanding the process of social political transformation, for which the ethnographic study of technical relations and expert practices, connecting this perspective to an interest on the role of materials of different kinds and the role these are playing in shaping overall infrastructure and techno-political relations. So that was a synthesis of what I found on your website, UCL. So you combine this with a study of energy and climate change, and this is actually what came into the book. And you're using Manchester as a case study, actually, from that. And in all of that, her work in general, and in the book in particular, you are interested in understanding contemporary manifestations of risk and responsibility. And climate change is, from that point of view, really a very good case, which can be used properly to highlight these risks and how they translate with knowledge, technology, expertise, territorial politics, and how they interact, actually. Because climate change is both global and very local. I've been involved in a project on air quality, and we had hard scientists in that project, really hard ones. The ones studying PM 2.5 in a very technical way. And it was not easy to get on the same page in terms of scientific vocabulary. So can you imagine broadening the discussion with lay people and things like that? So I understand the challenge behind of that, and I really appreciate your book. And the book is actually, the title is Thinking Like a Climate, Governing a City in Times of Environmental Change. It has been published last year, so we are perfectly in time to present it in the Hot Off the Press series. And this is one of the biggest challenges ahead for cities. So I very much welcome that, and thank you very much for being with us. And I will leave the floor to you, and hopefully there will be a good discussion afterwards.
Okay, thank you for your kind introduction and summary of some of my background and like how I came into this. And I'll talk a little bit more detail about that as well when I'm presenting. So I'll just share my screen. So let me just, okay. Okay, can you see that slide okay? Okay. Fantastic. So yeah, thank you to Yuri and to Yvonne for inviting me, and for Alexa as well for suggesting that I speak and talk about my book in this forum. It's really lovely to be here, and it's really nice to talk to an interdisciplinary kind of audience, people interested in cities and the future of cities, because that's very much like the context within which I've been thinking about issues around climate change. So yeah, so today the presentation is about the book. This is the cover of the book. It's Thinking Like a Climate, Governing a City in Times of Environmental Change, and it came out last October, so relatively recently still. And the book is really an exploration of the way that climate change is kind of impacting on the practices of trying to govern cities, and came out of lots of conversations with people actually kind of working across different cities, but is really focused, as Yuri said, on the city of Manchester. So I thought that I'd give a little bit of background as to how I came to this topic, because really I think of myself as a kind of anthropologist of technology and of infrastructure. And I actually came to be studying climate change through conversations that I'd been having with engineers. So prior to this project, I'd been doing work on road construction in Peru, looking at how to study relations between citizens and the state through the lens of looking at infrastructure projects. And I wanted to continue working with engineers and with these kinds of material interventions into social life. and speaking to some engineers working within the city of Manchester, which is where I actually live and where I've done research before, they were talking a lot about climate change mitigation and some of the activities that they were involved in to try to think about how to make the city more amenable to climate change. So my starting point for the project was really trying to understand what were the potential kind of unforeseen social and political consequences of climate change mitigation interventions and infrastructure projects. So I started with the kind of view of thinking about climate change through infrastructure. But what happened as I actually began the research was that through talking to people, through talking to a lot of policymakers and activists, as well as engineers and climate scientists, my attention started to shift from a focus on infrastructure to the political work that was going on to actually establish climate change as a matter of concern and a thing that cities needed to take into account within this particular urban setting of Manchester, and as part of kind of broader conversations about urban change. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the fieldwork that I did to give a bit of grounding as to like where the findings of the research come from, and then I'm going to talk about some of the issues that the book itself tackles. So in terms of fieldwork, the study is really at its core an ethnography of climate change politics and of climate change in the UK. And I spent time doing research between 2011 and 2018, following the activities of quite a kind of distributed network of people who've been trying to tackle climate change in the city of Manchester. And I looked at what they were doing and the challenges that they were facing. So at the core, the people who are involved in this research were held together largely through a steering group, which was constituted around a plan for managing the city's carbon emissions. This plan was published in 2009, and at the time it was given the title Manchester, A Certain Future. So the Manchester A Certain Future steering group members were very diverse, and they came from lots of different organisations around the city. So you had people from the city council, people from representing the 3 universities within the city, the National Health Service, people from environmental charities and environmental pressure groups, representatives of an engineering firm, a housing association, economic development organisations, and also some freelancers who are working in the environmental sector. And so it was the conversations and activities of this sort of distributed network of people that really formed the core focus for the study. So I went, the field work was quite, in some respects was quite unusual, because I was like traversing across different kinds of social spaces and attending quite a lot of different kinds of meetings and contexts. So I went to steering group meetings and events, but I also participated in critical fringe events by activist groups. And then right at the core of the research, I did 4 months of daily ethnographic fieldwork with the environmental strategy team within the city council, who were kind of managing this whole steering group process. And this involved attending public meetings and private meetings, shadowing the work of this team, and also shadowing the work of some people in other organisations. So I spent a bit of time with the housing association manager, and I looked at meetings and documents and the daily work of these organisations. So in terms of the project, Manchester then was this kind of relationally and spatially appropriate field site through which to look at the broader social and ethical and epistemological questions that seem to be being posed around the relationship between politics and environment when you start to talk about climate change. And when I was doing research, the head of the environmental strategy team at the council said to me that the great thing of working at the level of the city for him was that it gave you the opportunity both to reach up to the global and to have access to global forums like the COP meetings, which he had been part of, but also to kind of reach right down to the ground and be able to like touch people on the ground and be able to really feel the tangibility of climate change in place. And that really stuck in my mind, because I think it had a similar methodological resonance for me, that the city gave an opportunity to do an ethnographic study of a project of social transformation that allowed me both to kind of touch on the work of global institutions like the IPCC, as well as looking at local practices of those who were trying to respond to the policies that came out of those institutions. So the field site was Manchester, but it was also a field site that opened up to all different kinds of places that were beyond the city of Manchester. And some of these were geographical. So the fieldwork took me to Brussels, it took me to Linköping in Sweden, where there was some partner organizations working on similar issues, to other cities in the UK, like London, Lancaster, Bristol. But it also took me to other places further afield with the stories that people told. So it took me to Northern Ireland, to South America, to the United States, to Antarctica, to Australia, to China. These were all places that were kind of in people's imaginaries and radar of what, like how they were networking themselves and thinking about the problem of climate change. And then in addition to this, there were also the kind of non-geographically defined spaces that the research also led to. So the space of documents produced by government and intergovernmental organizations, the space of websites, of discussion forums and email exchanges, where ideas about good practice were being developed and shared. The space of technological networks, but also technological devices like energy monitors or solar panels or statistical models through which the work of trying to reduce climate emissions was really entangled and really kind of enacted in a day-to-day sense. And then finally, Manchester as a field site itself was not just a geographical context for the research, but like this problem of climate that people were trying to grapple with, the concept of the city was also present in the research. So the city was not only a place, but it was also a preoccupation. It was a concept or an idea itself, and something that I found really being reworked in relation to this project of reducing carbon emissions. So part of the challenge of trying to reduce carbon emissions at a city scale was the problem of trying to reimagine just what kind of social, environmental and technical entity the city itself was, where its boundaries were, and what it was made up of. So forging a local and situated response to the problem of rising temperatures at a global scale required people not just to act on the city, but also to kind of interrogate and recreate the very forms and categories of social organization, like the city or like the citizen, that were going to be necessary if they were going to bring about the kinds of changes that they were seeking to create. So as I started to do the research then, my questions had begun to shift away from this focus that I'd initially had on a concern with infrastructure projects and climate change mitigation, and had come to focus more on this way that people who were involved in these practices were actually kind of really struggling to define and shape the parameters of the problem of climate change that they were seeking to tackle. And this wasn't something that I necessarily anticipated before starting the research, but something that was very present at the time. And so this really shifted the focus of my book from a question about what are the social implications of climate change mitigation to a focus on what's the relationship is between climate change as a particular kind of problem space and other kinds of more settled or established forms of knowing social entities like the city or like society or culture. Okay, just go to the next slide. So now one of the implications of the shift in attention to the relationship between climate change and knowledge, or modern knowledge, which is the term I use, I said it led me down a route where this question about climate change and knowledge not only was a frame for looking at what people were struggling with or kind of debating and grappling with in these organizations that I was looking at, but also raised some quite profound questions about the relationship between climate change and the techniques and methods of my own discipline of anthropology. And one of the main kind of things that the book also contributes is an exploration of how climate change can actually become an object of anthropological research and what might need to happen to a discipline like anthropology to actually really enable this to happen. So one of the key things that I explore in the book is this challenge of how do you study climate change from the vantage point of a discipline like anthropology. And there are some parallel conversations that some scholars have been having within other disciplines. So Dipesh Chakrabarti in history has been thinking about the implications of climate change for historical analysis and theorization and thought, or Amitav Ghosh has similarly explored this in relation to fiction and literature. And I was really trying to grapple with this in terms of anthropology. So the first problem that I came up against in terms of how do we study climate change from an anthropological perspective was the question of how to study global climate change in a way that attended to the specific kind of global ontological hyper-objective kind of quality of climate change itself as it was evidenced in climate models. So when I started this research, I read quite widely on the anthropology of climate change, but most of the literature at that time was really around very kind of place-based specific studies of the way that changing weather patterns or changes in environmental conditions were affecting people in particular places. And this was very different to what I think I was trying to grapple with looking at the implications of climate as it appeared in climate models. So this local grounded research on communities affected by climate change is obviously really valuable in terms of understanding the varieties of ways in which climate change is going to affect people. But it didn't really help me much in understanding the ramifications of these global climate models within the research that I was doing in Manchester. And I think this was partly because what I found myself looking at in my fieldwork was not so much climate as weather or as specific environmental conditions in the here and now, but climate as this kind of probabilistic projection of a future generalized set of conditions that were based on aggregations of observed data, which were rendered meaningful through statistical methods. So my first challenge was like how to reposition the anthropology of climate change or allow for an anthropology of climate change that was also an anthropology of science and data and statistics. Okay, so whilst I was then interested in the manifestation of climate change in data traces that were then constituted into predictive models, I also was really interested in the way in which those models became manifest in particular place. So not just studying the models in terms of a kind of social studies of science or social studies of technology perspective that would look at the processes and practices of the scientists and engineers who build those models, but also to look at the social life of those models themselves. So I was really still concerned with like how to kind of locate this modeled rendering of the climate in a particular place. And I was trying not to necessarily oppose a kind of global or universal science that abstracts from the local with the kind of more authentic idea of local culture, but to really trace and attend to the locatedness of climate models themselves. So rather than already assuming that I knew what climate change was, or that climate change was necessarily transparently represented in these models, I actually found myself reposing the question, well, hang on, what actually is climate change? And how's it manifesting in my own field site? And in my research, it manifested in a series of kind of lively objects that were matters of concern. So it manifested in models, in graphs, in reports, numbers, percentages, pie charts, but also the stories that people told, the places where people lived, buildings, and the technologies through which they gained a sensitization to those places. So things like energy monitors. And then this opened up the possibility of a really kind of rather different version of climate change that I felt I was now able to try and start to study ethnographically. So in a sense, this is really an attempt to do an anthropological study or an ethnographic study of climate change rather than just the interpretation of climate change or climate change politics. So if the first problem then was how to locate anthropological questions about climate change in relation to these global climate models that are sort of out of place, the second challenge was how to locate this ethnographic work in relation to the future-oriented temporality of climate models. So anthropology as a discipline is often seen as the study of the contemporary. The late Paul Rabenau talks about anthropology as the study of the contemporary. And in studying contemporary relations, anthropologists have been pretty good at attending to the past, to the role of memory and traditions and history as the basis upon which the present comes into being. We think about anthropological focus on things like genealogy or inheritance or learning and enculturation. There's very much a kind of sense of the past building up to a present moment, which we're studying as anthropologists. But I think quite a number of scholars recently started to point out that anthropologists haven't really been as systematic in their study of the future as part of social life. But what was really clear to me during my research, that if I was going to engage with these climate models and the prognostics that these models put on the table, then I was going to need to find a way of engaging with and understanding the future and the way that the future was being framed and the way in which it was then making contemporary worlds and framing social practice in the present. So in my research, these futures manifested in various different forms. So I became really interested in concepts like the carbon budget, or what a scenario was when people were trying to work out about the implications of climate change for the adaptation that cities would need to undergo. Ideas about tipping points or risk and thresholds, or even like the more apocalyptic language of breakdown and catastrophe or doom or extinction. These were all very much kind of experiences that were infused by a particular kind of understanding of the future. So the challenge here then for me was a question like, how can I make this kind of future version of climate change present whilst not losing its futurity? So not just saying this is the kind of social construction of the future, but I'm trying to understand the materiality of the futures that these climate models were describing, and how to hold that in view. And practically, I think I did the same again as I'd done with the globality. So I proceeded by looking at the futurism of climate change as it manifested in actually existing social relations and social practices, and tried to trace how different kinds of versions of climate futures were then impacting on and impinging on the way that people were existing in the present. So here I was looking at things like the gap that emerges between future scenarios of temperature rise that might talk about there being a 50% chance that the temperature in a particular part of the city was going to increase by 4 degrees by 2020. And then the way that people were already engaging with questions of temperature, for example, thinking about the specific thermodynamic properties of buildings. And there's a kind of gap between these different registers of thinking about temperature. Or another example is the challenge that people were facing of how do you plan for a future in which the basis of that planning is grounded in these climate models, which by definition are going to be wrong if the action that you have in the present is successful. So it's a kind of weird kind of warping of the sense of the relationship between the present and the future. So this was the approach then that I took in trying to kind of conduct this anthropology of climate change. And what resulted then was an argument about what the implications for climate change seemed to be being for cities from the vantage point of these conversations in Manchester. And I explore this in the book by dividing my discussion into 2 parts. So I'm just going to talk briefly about that. I hope you can, I'll talk through this. I know the slide's a little bit small. So the first half of the book then is really concerned with trying to unpack the material propositions that are implicit in climate models and in a climatological rendering of social relationships. And here I really delve into the models themselves. I talked a lot to climate scientists and to the process by which their models were turned into matters of political concern. And so part one focuses on the techniques and the methods through which local climate futures really came in very kind of tangible ways to be imagined through carbon budgets, through carbon footprinting, through these climate change scenarios and targets and action plans. And it's in this first half of the book that I really explore some of the difficulties that bureaucrats and administrators were encountering in practice when they were trying to localize these global models of climate change and bring them into the here and now, and how these challenges are part of the story about the difficulties or the obstacles to developing an appropriate response to climate change. And when I say appropriate, I mean appropriate to the projections that are in a lot of the climate models. So what this first half of the book illustrates then is that the impetus to think like a climate, which is what I term this kind of attending to the relations that are traced in climate models. This had the effect of posing some really profound questions about the capacity of existing techniques of modern government to really tackle the entanglements of environmental and social relations. So this, for me, was made particularly evident in the way that climate change seemed to disrupt more linear, evidence-based ways of planning for the future. And one of the things that I look at is the way that foundational understandings of the relationship between knowledge, so bureaucratic knowledge or planning knowledge, and then action, so what you do on the basis of that knowledge, was really being thrown up in the air by climatological thinking. Acting then in relation to modeled knowledge about the future, in which the people doing the acting were themselves realized they were sort of entangled in these models, created all kinds of epistemological instabilities that were quite challenging for people. So the second half of the book then departs from this story about this kind of narration of how climate models were being incorporated into bureaucratic processes, and then tries to explore some signs of alternative modes of relating to the climate and how they were being forged in other kinds of spaces within the city. So the second half of the book focuses on sites where the relationship between knowing and acting were really being reworked, not necessarily in the form of policies or targets or projections, but often more in the form of things like experiments or trials, or a kind of diagnostic relationship, an investigative relationship into trying to rethink what the city was, or even a kind of strange kind of mimicry of the bureaucratic form, but in which it was being kind of disrupted or undermined or warped. So in the second half of the book, then, I try to really understand the appearance of these sometimes surprising objects and techniques that seem to be emerging in response to climate change, and that were often emerging somewhat in the margins, but which really seem to engage the challenges of climate change in a different kind of way to the more governmental based practices. And what's important about the second part of the book is that I really try to derive, not just describe these practices, but also derive analytical insights from these alternative ways of thinking with the climate. So I'm not just looking at them as practical, technical solutions to climate change, but rather trying to think what is the theoretical possibilities of these alternative ways of acting, and how might they operate as kind of figurative devices that could help us reimagine where the social lies in climate change. And this brings me back to some of those questions about anthropology that I was talking about earlier. So there's a couple of concepts in the book. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Am I okay? Yeah. Okay, so there's a couple of concepts in the book that I thought I'd just spend a little bit of time explaining. The first of these is the concept of thinking like a climate, which itself is not very obvious what that means from first glance. So in using the term thinking like a climate, I'm proposing really a way of exploring and understanding the entanglements of the materiality of climate change, including this future presence of climate change, practices of representation and forms of imagination or thought through which people can engage with climate change as an issue. And in order to be able to address the question of what was happening in Manchester and what people were struggling with and grappling with, I found myself increasingly approaching climate change, not so much as a kind of ontological phenomena or a cultural practice with ontological dimensions, but rather as a set of material practices and a material process that seem to be exhibiting epistemological and figurative qualities. So as climate seeped into the imagination and imaginations helped to surface the undesirable effects of a changing climate system, I found not so much people confronting nature out there, but instead experiencing themselves entangled in a kind of relational nexus whereby processes of signification, both human and non-human, were affecting one another. So I was trying to capture this, what felt like an ecology of signs, where climate seemed to shimmer into view through these traces in climate models. When those models were entered into workplaces via things like online training packages. And the complexity of ecological relations became smoothed into a curve on a graph. And then that curve on the graph had the capacity to create a kind of knot in the stomach of the person who was looking at it and reading it, thinking about the implications of it for themselves and for future generations. And it's these kinds of entanglements that I'm trying to kind of get at when I'm talking and using the term thinking like a climate. So my first point of reference for this term is to understand climate through the work of Gregory Bateson, and in particular his comments on the notion of the idea. So in the opening paragraph to Steps to an Ecology of Mind, Bateson writes that the book proposes a new way of thinking about ideas and aggregates of those ideas, which he calls minds. He says, this way of thinking I call the ecology of mind, or the ecology of ideas. And then he goes on to elaborate. So he says, at the beginning, let me state my belief that such matters as the bilateral symmetry of an animal, the patterned arrangements of leaves in a plant, the escalation of an armaments race, the process of courtship, the nature of play, the grammar of a sentence, and the mystery of biological evolution and the contemporary crisis in man's relationship to his environment can only be understood in terms of such an ecology of ideas as I propose. So for Bateson, what's really important about this concept of ideas seems to be not whether ideas are material or mental, but the ideas are kind of entities which have formal properties, and through those formal properties, they communicate with one another. So an idea for Bateson is more like an arrangement of letters or of cells or of electrical pulses that interact with other arrangements or forms. So the fundamental question that Bateson then sets himself out to answer is, how do these different kinds of ideas, these stabilizations or patternings, then interact with one another? And through a study of this interaction, he proposes to explore how social arrangements and phenomena actually kind of emerge iteratively. So, and another point that Bateson highlights is that he also is very committed to attending to scientific data in his research. So similar to some of the things that I was trying to think about around not just doing a social study of the production of scientific data from the perspective of the people who are producing that data, how do we also attend to what that data is telling, to the story that data is telling, the material relations that it's representing. And he also attends to data. He stresses that data are the most reliable source of information, and from them the scientist must start. They provide his first inspiration, and to them he must return later. So for Bateson, incorporating data into his analysis as data, and not just something to be socially deconstructed, is justified by reference to this idea of an ecology of ideas. So if we take nature's out there to be material, and then interpretations in here to be ideational, then it's necessary to make a decision at which point the material is transformed into the ideation, or when the raw becomes cooked or reality becomes data. But I felt reading Bateson that if we follow his interest in concerning ourselves not with the idea of whether something is real, but with its form, its patterning, how it holds together, then things and data and their interpretation by humans or machines can all be addressed on the same plane of, in his case, in his language, the plane of signs. So the task of the analyst becomes one of observing the interactions, not just of a community of people, but of an ecology of ideas of which people and their thoughts are just one part. So the key point here is that attending to climate change as a form of thought allows us to trace how climate change might come into contact with or manifest in relation to other forms of thought. And a major challenge posed by climate change, at least in the research that I was doing, was that climate change as it manifested in these models and graphs and data traces that were entangled with people's practices, was that this form of thought really rubbed up against or came into contact with the form of thought of modern urban governance that had emerged from attending to a very different set of material processes and preoccupations. So this being industrialization, urbanization, and even the formatting of the economy as a key object of governance throughout the 20th century. So this focus on thinking like a climate enabled me to really attend to the way in which different modes of being and thinking were existing in the same space. And it brings me to the second kind of concept that I wanted to talk about, which is the idea of contact zones, or points where different modes of being in the world come into confrontation with one another. And whilst I'm talking here, the focus of the book is primarily on what form of thought climate change is, so which is why I'm using the term thinking like a climate. It's not the only form of thought that exists, and it's the confrontation between climate and other modes of existence that interested me. So one of the contact zones that I focus on in the book is the contact zone between the practice of governing the urban population and the governance of the city in terms of climate change. So so here in this particular contact zone between local government and climate science, what I started to draw attention to was the specific kind of histories of the bureaucratic practices that people who I was working with had for thinking about and understanding what the city was. And this kind of had emerged out of a history that had really rendered the city as a governable space through practices of enumeration, surveying, and biopolitical modes of management and control, about which a lot has been written within disciplines like urban studies. So I focused a lot in the book on buildings, and I looked at the governance of buildings, and I went back to look at how the governance of buildings had emerged historically in Manchester. And this question took me back to the early days of industrialization in the city, and actually to the birth of social statistics as a method of dealing with the aberrant and problematic living conditions of the urban poor. And amongst the people who I was working with in the city council and within many of the institutions that I talked to, they were still working through the frame of gathering aggregated data on things like health and living conditions that would then provide justifications for things like investments in infrastructures, social policy, and healthcare. So they were still working very much in this mode of kind of biopolitical understanding of the city, gathering bottom-up data and mapping the city and trying to understand its problems in those terms. But one of the challenges was that these aggregations of data were quite distinct from the way that global climate models were creating an impetus for action. So instead of bottom-up data collection on the city, these general circulation models of global climate change started by positing the whole of humanity globally as a kind of site of climate deviancy. And this was a really different way of formatting the social and its problems. You had a number that would, or a set of kind of projections that talked about the effect of global humanity on the global climate system. And then this had to be disaggregated down to levels that were amenable to the scale of something like a city. And actually a lot of the work that I observed people doing was trying to reconcile these different ways of formatting the city, which is where I'm kind of using the language of contact zones to think about the way in which people were actually doing that. So here, So one thing that people were doing was trying to like manage these contact zones. And then the other thing that people were doing was trying to kind of come up with alternative ways of engaging with climate change through the creation of alternative kinds of objects and subjects that would be more amenable to thinking about and tackling climate change in the city. And this is where the experiments and trials that I mentioned before came in. But this attention to these contact zones also ended up forcing me to also wonder about my own methods of anthropological research and to attend to some of the latent and obscured and taken for granted dimensions of anthropological production, which actually were also similarly experienced for me as a kind of contact zone between climate science and anthropology. So in the conclusion to the book, I come back to this question of how anthropology is kind of confronted by climate change and how it might equip itself with tools to more adequately address the implications of climate change. And I reflect here on the relationship between ethnographic description and the objects and techniques that are offering people a different way of engaging with the climate. So here, I've got a quote here from Kirsten Hastrup, who says, to talk across disciplinary boundaries, anthropologists need to cultivate a more comprehensive interest in the interpenetration of local and global climate issues in different registers of knowledge. So the form of humanity and personhood and relationality that was highlighted by the objects and techniques that I talk about in the second half of the book pointed for me to alternative ways of attending ethnographically to climate change, which went beyond filling in the gaps of these global abstractions with local detail. And this new direction for me entailed an anthropology of extended and ecosystemic relations, which was very much kind of materially responsive anthropology. It was very much aligned to the practices of the people I was doing research with. And it was about an anthropology that could learn to be affected by climate change and cultivating new grounds for anthropological inquiry and practice in a climate changed world. So this is like the moment I find myself in now, and this is the mode that I'm working in and attempting to conduct anthropological research in now. And I'm really interested in how to bring together an attention to the materiality of climate change with the reflexivity and criticality of anthropological research. And I found that this is quite an unsettling place to be in, as it has forced kind of a reconsideration of some of the boundaries between the practices of knowledge construction and the kind of hidden materialities that are entailed in that. So I've got a few examples here of some projects that I'm involved in at the moment and some things that have happened as a result of the research. The first on the left is a blog post that I wrote a couple of years ago when I had kind of reflected, where I reflect a lot on the kind of carbon footprint of our own disciplines, specifically thinking about the role of flying in academic knowledge production and how we can attend to the material foundations of our own knowledge production. And along those lines, I'm involved in a kind of network that is looking at questions around low carbon research. So the image of the solar protocol comes from that project, and the solar protocol is a network of solar powered servers that and it's attempting to kind of host academic knowledge production on these solar servers. But because of the propensities of solar energy, they force us to think about the amount of data that we are producing when we have Zoom meetings or when we have high quality videos, and it's actually changing. It's led by media scholars, and they're actually thinking very much about, how's this affecting the way in which we think about the media forms that we might use as academics. And then the final image is of an energy, a graph of energy production. And I've put that there because I'm also working in a collaborative project with engineers around how to bring together the engineering, science and anthropology to think through some of these issues moving forward. So yeah, that's that's me, and that's the book, and I'm really looking forward to hearing any questions that people have.
Thanks a lot. It was very challenging, very engaging, very interesting. I like it a lot. And when you started quoting Gregory Bateson, I was really melting down because I very much like him and the way he developed this ecology of ideas. and the system which connects all the dots and elements. Okay, so the floor is open to comments, questions. They go in many different directions, actually. I think it's extremely rich. And yes, Alexa.
I just raised my hand the first because I have to leave the first, I think. So thank you, Hannah, for again another insight in your wonderful book. And I think I would like to take profit from the audience and from my colleagues from social sciences with respect to what you were putting so much forward as a challenge for anthropology. And I was asking myself, isn't a qualitative geography or sociology, I mean, oh, I'm not ready to speak English today, who use qualitative methods, wouldn't they be put in the same self-questioning of how to study a city in respect to how climate is problematized or articulated? Or would you, for instance, Yvonne or Yuri, ask the question differently? I guess you would. So I would be really interested in this disciplinary approach that Hannah, of course, put forward, and how this echoes with your reflection on how to study urban, questions of climate change, of governance, etc.
Do you want me to respond, or Yvonne?
I would very much like to hear what my colleagues would say to that. And of course, I'm sure you have experiences with, because with presenting your work in interdisciplinary contexts. And I mean, you're working on an interdisciplinary setting with all these experts and who are thinking the climate. So it's a not very clear question, but I'm interested to challenge the interdisciplinarity.
Mm-hmm.
May I step in and accept the challenge? Because Alexa's question is kind of emphasizing something I realized while listening to Hannah. Hannah, you mentioned that you looked at context zones, interpretation of models, the use of interpretations, and this kind of triggered my memory on the assemblage approach we used in the project when we analyzed gentrification from a different angle, not taking displacement and affordability as a starting point, but looking at metrics. So what kind of data is used to prove or unprove gentrification? What kind of practices are in place to use these metrics, this data, in order to make an argument? And what kind of, let's say, policies are emerging out of that? So in a way, Alexa, I think I'm now replacing climate change with another topic in urban research, but I think as a social scientist, I'm very attracted by these more, let's say, relational approaches that look at different layers and how these relations come together, and not starting with, actors or materiality or governance, but rather looking at the different layers and how they come together and how they inform each other and and develop something else. So I'm now taking the ball by Alexa, bringing it back to Hannah, asking her whether this assemblage thinking is also kind of informing your approach in research.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think that when I was doing this research, and before I was doing it, I was working at a research centre, and we had things like it was an interdisciplinary research centre, so we were talking about things like assemblage theory. We were reading a Deleuze reading group. We were reading a lot of kind of relational theory, and also within anthropology, I think there's a sort of overlap between an interest in anthropology in relations, coming through the work of people like Marilyn Strathern, who's worked very much on the idea of relations is really central to anthropology, and the attention to relations in science and technology studies and through kind of assemblage theory. So I think there are some similarities. I think there's the kind of anthropological inflection probably comes from, and the reason why I didn't position this explicitly in terms of assemblage theory is that I think within anthropology, theoretical claims and interventions tend to emerge through ethnography rather than being imposed in advance. And so whilst I think there's very fruitful and generative for thinking about what one pays attention to, I think I'd probably attend to it more in terms of method rather than a kind of theoretical starting point. Of course, those things are blurred. You can't really have, like, I think your theory is your method at the same time. So I wouldn't have like positioned this as deploying assemblage theory, but I think in terms of its methodology, it draws very much on kind of approaches that put relations at the fore. And I suppose like one of the things that indicates that probably is that one of the critiques that's often made of kind of assemblage approaches is comes from a more kind of critical political perspective that says, oh, well, this, you're not deploying the terms of political critique, and you're not therefore able to kind of make an intervention into how change will happen. And I think what I am trying to do is articulate a descriptive register or form through which to describe what's happening without already necessarily having a fixed language of political critique. And I think that potentially opens this kind of work up to that same criticism by people who come from a much stronger kind of Marxist perspective or political economy perspective that would be looking for a stronger critique. And I know that I've had people say that ask for more of a kind of critical perspective. I think it's critical in its own terms, but so I think that's also maybe indicative that it is kind of aligned with the thinking within other disciplines, which really has kind of engaged very closely with assemblage thinking.
I don't know if I should also take up the challenge of Alexa by moving the question back to you, Hannah, following a bit Yvonne's direction, but from a different point of view. I was involved in another project on air quality, as I mentioned before. And one of the key questions we asked a lot of people, actually 16,000 people, was who do you think is responsible for, in that case, it was air quality or air pollution, but you could ask the same question for climate change. Mm. Actually, there was an incredible gap between who is really responsible in relation to the hard data provided by the hard scientists and what the people perceived to be the person or the industry or the one who is polluting, actually. And this brings me to another question to you, actually, because you mentioned mayors, you mentioned experts, you mentioned activists, and you might mention also lay people who do not know anything. Mm-hmm. And here, the perception is absolutely crucial. And to this perception, and here I link a bit to Alexa's hidden agenda, maybe, or to Thorsten's hidden agenda, visualization of processes can play an important role in awakening fear or perceiving risk. When you see the model calculations of what will happen with the oceans rising and the heat and everything like that. So this might change people's perceptions somehow. And the portfolio of options that policymakers, not just at city level, but also at city level, goes from end-of-pipe solutions or behavioral solutions. And this goes back to you in the sense that you were asking, okay, what can we do? Who does what, in what ways? And probably the perception influences also very much precisely that. So what kind of solution do we put forward? And what are the political implications of these solutions? So do we want the people to change? Do we act to provide system change for infrastructure, for whatever kind? Or do we find a balance between the two approaches? So I'm not sure I asked a question or more broader comment, but in any case, I think there are elements which influence very much the way in which we think like a climate, or we think like air pollution, or we think like whatever. And Bateson, from that point of view, is fantastic, I think.
Yeah. I suppose a few reflections on what you were just talking about. So one is that I didn't do that much research with what one would call lay people in relation to in this project, because I was following those people who are very actively engaged in climate activism. So even if they were late, you know, obviously it's about positionality, but even people who were kind of part of these discussions in the role of citizens were people who were already kind of on board with and often had a bit of a kind of activist sense of themselves. So, and I think that's partly because, and it kind of comes back a bit to this question of like, how would anthropology have to change to be able to study these kinds of things? But I think one of the challenges is when I was starting this research in like 2010, I don't think there was a very lively or active conversation among, communities or groups of people about climate change. So if as an ethnographer, you want to study something, you go somewhere and you're spending time with a group of people, and then if they're not talking about it, like how do you study it? And anthropology and ethnography has been quite reticent to kind of provoke people to respond to the agenda of the researcher, because the whole point is that you're looking at things from the native's point of view, from the perspective of people themselves and their concerns and their preoccupations. And I think that has made it quite difficult. That's probably one of the reasons I didn't really do research with lay people around climate change. Subsequently, and having done this project, I've actually kind of moved a bit more into that. So I worked with some activists. For example, we did a energy walk. We looked at the history of the electricity infrastructure in the city, and we did this walk around the city, kind of attending to the specific histories of electricity and how that had changed and how people were or weren't entangled with the electricity, with a kind of background preoccupation around climate change and decarbonisation and changes in the electricity system that are underway at the moment. And that was an attempt to kind of both engage people, but also see how people responded to that. And there was a bit more of a public audience for that. And I'm now involved in another project with some of the people I was doing fieldwork with, which is about bringing climate data and data on climate and energy, like publicly available data on climate and energy, to communities in a town on the edge of Greater Manchester. And that's very much like working with people who haven't in the past had any like involvement or engagement in climate change. And so that's ongoing, and that will see what comes out of that. But I think it'd be the part of the purpose of that project is exactly to look in a very grounded sense about the negotiations, and I suppose to add to some of the more survey-based studies which have been done about attitudes towards climate change, to really see how people respond and think about the kind of interpersonal politics that is at play when people are confronted with climate data or energy data, questions of trust, questions of legitimacy, and those kinds of things, which I'm sure will be at play in that kind of setting. So yeah, I think there's a lot more to be done there, and maybe just coming back to Alexa's question about different disciplines and the challenges that they're facing. I've had quite a lot of conversations within UCL with a kind of interdisciplinary group led by a climate scientist, and certainly people coming more from the climate though within that group, those people coming more from a climate science perspective, their kind of line is that we kind of know the science, it's fairly, there's quite a lot of consensus, it's fairly clear like what the issues are, but what they now feel confronted by is like a complete kind of challenge around the social kind of causes and implications of climate change, and they're like seeking all kinds of people from all different like walks of life to try to kind of get a hand on the social dimensions of climate change. So it's interesting how in different disciplines people are being challenged in different ways to think about climate change and to think about their own work in relation to the issues that it puts on the table.
I can definitely imagine myself outside of my comfort zone by talking to engineers. So congratulations on you on taking.
There's a lot of being outside one's comfort zone.
I can imagine.
Disciplinary work.
We do have a question by Harald Schweiger in the chat that I'd like to raise. He's thanking you for your presentation and for providing the book. And he would like to know which of the projects of the steering group on climate change in Manchester sounded most promising and interesting to you.
That's a good question. So there were, there were a number of projects that I look at in the book and a number of things that were underway. And I got more involved in some than others. I have a lot more knowledge about some than others. So I think that practically where there was traction were activities that were related to the institutions that were involved in the steering group itself. So for example, energy, one of the reasons why there was a lot of attention to buildings and changes in the carbon emissions of the city council's buildings and the buildings of the organisations represented on the steering group, so the universities or the housing associations, was that was something where people had an institutional link that meant that they could do something, and where it was quite difficult was where the whole city was being evoked as the thing that needed to change, because in the sense there wasn't the institutional context or the organizational channels or structures through which to bring about the kind of changes that were being pursued. So one of the reasons that I was given access to spend time with the environmental strategy team within the local authority was because there were two main commitments in this that this steering group were trying to achieve. One was a 41% reduction in carbon emissions for the city by 2020, and that was like agreed in 2009. And then the other one was to bring about a culture change in the city, to put in place a low carbon culture. And that second question was like, first of all, always being forgotten because it was kind of quite vague, but it was also when I spoke to the head of the environmental strategy team, he was like, oh, great, you're an anthropologist, you can help us bring about a low carbon culture in the city. So I don't know what difference my involvement in the project made to that ambition, but I think it was where, to answer your question, I think it was where people within the steering group had kind of tangible lines of authority or power to make a change that things started to happen. But again, I think these, the nature of change is there was an interesting kind of temporal quality to the impetus for change. There's a lot of criticism by activists that people weren't acting fast enough and really like talking about the urgency of needing to act much more quickly. But then, what constituted acting was also interesting to me, and the fact that these people were being mobilized and brought into a conversation, and that was then kind of spreading out into the city, was creating a set of conditions in which it became it was shifting from being kind of weird to talk about climate change to being legitimate to talk about climate change. And I think that I did observe that shift over the period of time. And people like, you know, the school strikes, the public profile of people like Greta Thunberg, all like have contributed to making climate change not just be a sort of niche thing that weird people talk about, into being something that there is a kind of language for, and whilst there's still politics around it, I think that's shifted a bit.
Thanks a lot. The floor is still open to the audience to leave questions or to ask questions. So are there any? Just raise your hand or put the question to the chat. While you might think about a question, Hannah, I'm coming back to your approach as an anthropologist and what you mentioned before, becoming part of the field or studying people in places. And it was really interesting to listening to your approach, for instance, attending for 4 months different meetings and so on and so forth. And I was wondering, how do your research partners in that regard react on your findings? So is there also something like a reflective component by being an anthropologist in the field of climate change? So I was wondering about your reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a bit nerve-wracking sharing your like findings with people who you're like, I always find that the most nerve-wracking thing is sharing findings with people who you've done the research with, because you're kind of you're speaking for what they've told you, and you want to make sure that you've represented people appropriately. The people, I mean, I've had quite a lot of engagement with the book. Some of the people who I did research with have read it, which is also quite a privilege in a way, because I think for anthropologists, a lot of times one's working with people or communities where, like, for, you know, who are not versed in the academic language that we might be using, and either can't read the book or wouldn't be interested in it or wouldn't understand what the conversation is about. And I did try and write it in a way that I hoped would like be open enough that it was at least kind of accessible to the kinds of people that I did research with, who wouldn't necessarily be immersed in the debates within anthropology. And yeah, I think, you know, I've had quite positive responses from people about it. I think people found it interesting and, you know, and related to it, but found it a different kind of retelling of their experiences to what they were used to. So that was kind of what people said to me. I had a couple of people say that they found it quite hopeful, which I found, like, I didn't feel very hopeful when I was writing it. So I was quite intrigued by what they meant by that. But I think that's probably because, yeah, I mean, there's different registers within which things could be hopeful or not hopeful. But I think that there's a lot of a kind of sense of being confronted by the scale of the problem, something like climate change, just like the impossibility of being able to do anything. And maybe there's something about then, by grounding that in a place and in particular relationships and in particular practices, and showing how people are doing stuff and what the nature of that doing is, that maybe, I mean, I think maybe that's what people were kind of feeling. Oh, okay, there is a way of doing something, there is a way of proceeding. So that was one of the other responses that that I got. I haven't had any like critical responses from people I did fieldwork with, but then maybe those people haven't read the book.
But I think that's a great achievement, to reduce also complexity and to raise optimism by saying you can actually do something if you think smaller and place-based, or whatever we use to explain approaches of possibilities. That's really great to hear. Thanks for this. It's quite inspiring also as a researcher.
I had another comment actually, just like related to something you were saying earlier about the different disciplines and how people were rethinking disciplines. And I haven't really, I wouldn't want to speak for like other disciplines where I haven't really kind of engaged in that question for them about how climate change might be challenging them. But one area which surprised me, where I felt like quite a lot of people were having similar kinds of posing similar questions or having similar conversations, was in the discipline of architecture. So there seemed to be quite a lot of people working within the field of architecture who were trying to kind of think critically about what architecture is, what it's for, what it means to kind of propose to kind of view the world through the lens of the built environment or of a building, and how a more kind of ecosystemic set of relations could be incorporated into architectural thinking. And that I think it had surprised me, and partly I do write about buildings in the book, but I don't think it's that was the connection. I think that it's that there's something about the move from a kind of modernist framed, maybe constrained way of approaching a topic with particular kinds of parameters around it, and that for architects, as for some of the other disciplines like anthropology and some of the other ones I mentioned, that are being required to think beyond those boundaries, they're also then kind of thinking, okay, there's some kind of really profound challenges to how you think as an architect when you have to take into account these relationships. So there was a project which was looking project led by architect called Lindsay Bremner at Westminster University that was called Monsoon Assemblages. She's using the language of assemblages as well, but she was that project was looking at the monsoon, and it was looking at these kind of the monsoon as a kind of weather system and imaginary and an event, but also something really grounded in place in the cities that she was doing her work in. So there was a similar kind of shifting of scales. And I was just reading another book by an architect called Kiel Moe, I think his name is, and who called Insulating Modernism, and it's like a complete, and it's a kind of critique of the way that architects have thought about buildings in terms of their thermodynamics and their insulation. And he kind of explodes this by thinking in these more kind of extended relational terms. So I found that really interesting, that architecture was a field in which some of these conversations also seem to be happening. And yeah, I would be interested, I think it would be really fascinating to know more about where these conversations are within other social science disciplines. I mean, obviously geography has always thought about in a way, geography has been a discipline that's always been grappling with how to bring together the physical and the human. And in that, I think we could probably take a lot of leads from geographers in terms of how they've done that.
That's interesting, because it's by nature, and I would argue that we also look more into ethnographical approaches nowadays, and we very much orient ourselves towards anthropology and sociology. And this brings me to Yuri, because Yuri, you raised your hand.
Actually, yes, I was inspired by your issue about buildings. And in Milan, which is in Italy, in Lombardy, in the northern part, you have a very nice building, which is called Bosco Verticale, the vertical woods. It won 2015 the prize for the nicest skyscraper, and it is allegedly CO2 neutral. It has a lot of plants all around, very nice. And I don't know how you translate Betriebskosten, Yvonne, but the monthly costs,
maintenance costs or utility
maintenance costs of a building are about 2,000 euros per month per flat.
Okay.
So I was wondering, and so this is a premise of my question. And my question is actually, I'm very much in favor of greening cities and doing whatever it takes to contrast heat spots in the city and to contrast climate change, etc., etc. But there is also an implication which is strongly social, in the sense that you are greening maybe a neighborhood, and then suddenly this neighborhood gentrifies. So you produce green gentrification processes. Need somehow to control this dynamic, and have also, and here I'm aware this is a normative debate, a just climate change, whatever kind of intervention. It's not that easy, because sometimes you have to balance technicalities, infrastructure, and things like that, and you have to keep in control the social impact of your intervention. And very often here in Vienna, the 7th district is a fancy district ruled by Greens, and they do wonderful traffic-related slow streets. And in these streets, you have a very nice organic market with food and things like that. But when you buy 100 grams of cheese or buy fancy clothes, which are vegan with a very low impact, they cost almost a fortune. So 100-gram cheese is €4.50. So I was wondering about the social implications of all of that. And there is a trade-off here, I see, between the need to level up, as you say in the UK, as we learned today in another meeting, the expectations, the consumption needs or desires of a broad mass of population, and the quite elitarian perspective of climate change or climate protection or whatever related to green and fancy and organic, etc. So I was wondering, how do you see this trade-off or this potential it should not be a trade-off, but in many cases it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's I don't think it's inevitable that just because something is, environmentally sustainable, it has to be socially divisive. But I completely agree with you that is how it is manifesting in so many circumstances. And there's all these discussions underway around the idea of, as you say, a just transition, a Green New Deal, but this seems to me, a massive space of maybe using the kind of idea of like agonistic politics. This is a space of kind of a battleground rather than something where there's easy solutions, and maybe just even noticing that this is a battleground is maybe, and the kind of myth of the easy green technical solution that's going to tick all the boxes is a first stepping stone to being able to attend to those kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, in the context of the UK, I've been thinking about that. I haven't been looking at it, myself, but I think there's a really interesting question around class and environmentalism that I would love to kind of know more about or think more about, because I think it is very there's a lot of kind of talk about sustainability being a form of social transformation that can bring about more kind of egalitarian or equal societies, but the evidence is also that it's not at all. And actually one of the interesting points that one of the climate scientists based in Manchester called Kevin Anderson makes is he kind of like cuts through the sort of self-satisfaction of kind of middle class people living in gentrified areas buying vegan clothing and like shopping in organic markets, and reminds us, those people, that that we're the ones with the biggest carbon footprint still. It's not that you might feel kind of self-satisfied about living in a building with trees on the side of it, like the green forest. I think I've seen the building that you're talking about, and I watched a YouTube video about it one time. But there's other aspects of one's life that you're in and entangled in as a kind of professional who might be living in one of those buildings. That means there's actually a high environmental cost to your way of living too. So that's another dimension of it too, that it's not only that separates off environmental ways of living as only for people who have a certain level of wealth, but that it's also a bit of myth, like that people aren't even living that in that environmentally friendly way, even when you're living in one of those kinds of buildings or being part of those practices. So I think these are huge issues, but as I say, I'm just even recognizing the complexity and being able to have a language to talk about it. I think that it's the more dangerous thing is just the green kind of techno solutionism that says, oh, you know, we'll just put some trees on the side of buildings, or we'll just do this, we'll just do that, and then it will all be fine. And that's that clearly is having all kinds of unforeseen consequences. Yeah. Maybe coming back to some of the questions I actually started out with in this project about what are the unforeseen kind of social consequences of these mitigation projects, which I think is still an important question. It's just not the one that ended up being what people were preoccupied by or in the work I was doing.
Thank you.
May I take up the last point you mentioned as a, let's say, concluding question to you as an author of a book, because a book as an output of research, and you're also telling quite a complex story. So I would also like to congratulate you to really write a book in times of papers and short results and short well-known journals. And by the way, it's one of the books with the most beautiful cover pages I've seen the last year. I wanted to tell you this.
Thank you to Duke University Press have great displays.
Oh wow, Yuri, we should send them an email for our communication activities, huh? So I was wondering, you as an author of a book, what was the most, let's say, challenging part to write the book, and what was probably also the biggest benefit or also the biggest pleasure to you to write the book?
Yeah, I mean, they may be related. I think it's like, it is nowadays it does feel like a luxury to be able to have the headspace and the time to write a book. And I think I started doing this research when I was working in a research centre that gave me the time to do the actual field work. And then I moved to UCL and I was teaching, and it's really hard to write a book under those conditions, and to have the space to be able to write in a really routine way. So it's only because I got a writing fellowship for a year that it really enabled that space to be able to write. And I think then it was a real luxury. I think in anthropology, monographs are still very much valued and expected as a way that one writes up one's research. I think because you're often following a kind of a question or a problem or a community for an extended length of time, and it takes you to places that you didn't necessarily anticipate when you first started. So it's less of a kind of testing of a hypothesis or a kind of answering a specific question, but more a kind of descriptive exercise, often where you're trying to capture the nuances of a particular moment or set of relationships. Then it lends itself to a book format. It's hard to do that in a journal article form, although everyone does, and one kind of frames different bits of the research for journal articles, but I think it made a massive difference. I think it's like makes a massive difference it made a massive difference to my own thinking to be able to conceive of it as a book project rather than thinking of it as a series of journal articles that maybe would be responding to other agendas rather than necessarily responding to the circumstances and the issues that I found in the course of the research. So that's probably the biggest difference, I think, that it allowed me to explore things really from the ground up and trying to kind of find a language for describing and articulating what I thought was happening and the main things that were preoccupying people and challenging people in the field site, rather than starting with a set of obviously it's framed and informed by a set of kind of longer running conversations within anthropology and broader social sciences. But when you're writing a journal article, you're writing for a much more narrow kind of set of preoccupations and then making a contribution to that specific kind of moment in an argument. And a book just allows a lot more freedom. And freedom, a lot more creativity, I think. It allows for different forms of writing more of a creative exercise in communication.
Thanks for sharing, also for sharing with us and with students, because sometimes it's, you don't think about the constraints of writing in different ways, and also you don't really think about the audience of your writing. And I can imagine that your audience is quite different with this book you published compared to the journal papers you published on the same topic.
I think so, yeah.
Harald Schweiger, I noticed your question in the chat. May I ask how you would like to continue your research in the close future? That's a perfect final question. Thank you.
Yeah. So I have a few kind of things that I'm doing at the moment that are continuing this research project, much more at the moment focused on around questions of how people are experiencing and understanding energy as an aspect of climate change. So I've got funding to work with an engineer who develops temperature sensors and visualizations around energy, again in buildings, and we devised this project. There's quite a lot of work on environmental sensing and how it changes people's behaviors, or it doesn't change their behaviors. This project is looking more at the way that people's engagement in questions around policy and their incorporation into politics is informed or not by these kinds of data visualizations and forms of sensing. So that project's about to kick off in October, and that will be interesting. I haven't worked in an interdisciplinary project like that before, so I think that's going to be interesting to see how that kind of collaboration works. And then I've got another thing that I'm doing at the moment, which is also, I suppose, about energy data and political participation, which I mentioned before, which is working with some of the people I did field work with before. And it's using, the project is developing a data dashboard, if you like, that is going to have information about a particular town. It's going to have information around questions of climate change and carbon emissions, but also about mapping out the energy infrastructure and thinking about possibilities for low carbon energy in this town. And my role is really looking at how this data kind of is put into the social context of these two communities in the town and how people respond to it. And so that kind of sits alongside this other project. So I've got those two things underway at the moment. And but I think I'm also teaching quite a lot, so trying to juggle that alongside other responsibilities. So that my longer term aim is to get some more kind of dedicated funding to create some space to tie some of these smaller projects together.
So we keep our fingers crossed for another writer scholarship, and we are looking forward to future books. Thanks a lot, Hannah. I'm handing over to Yuri.
Thanks a lot also from my part. I don't want to make you waiting for the evening rest. It was really very interesting, and I look forward to keep in touch somehow.
Yeah.
We're having very similar research agendas from different disciplinary perspectives, but actually very complementing the topics in the terms of topics. So it would be very nice to continue this conversation at some other point.
Definitely, and I would love to hear more about what you're working on as well, your group. So yeah.
Thanks again. And this was the last presentation of books this year, but we will go on next after the summer, actually. Still this year, but after the summer. And we will keep in touch in one way or another.
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation. Enjoyed it.
It was a pleasure.